Imagine, you are an American in 1973. Your country landed on the moon just 4 years earlier. Your military is the strongest on the planet. Your economy is the largest in the world. In your garage sits a Cadillac DeVille as long as a boat with a roaring V8 engine that drinks gasoline the way people drink water. And you do not care, because gasoline is cheaper than soda by the liter. Life is good. America is good. Everything is good. Then, one morning in November of 1973, you drive your Cadillac to the usual gas station and see a line of people so long that you cannot see the end of it. You ask the man in front of you, "How long have you been waiting?" 2 hours. And I'm only halfway through the line. Welcome to the 1973 oil crisis, an event Americans never truly forgot. Even though many people do not know where it actually began, before there could be a crisis, there had to be complacency. To understand why the shock of 1973 was so devastating, you need to understand how the United States and the Western world as a whole had been living in a state of complacency for the previous 2 decades. After the Second World War, the American economy exploded in a way never seen before in history. Factories were operating at full capacity. The middle class was expanding at a staggering speed. People were buying refrigerators, televisions, washing machines, things their parents' generation could only dream about. And above all, people were buying cars. Lots of cars. Big, shiny cars with enormous engines and fuel consumption rates that, looking back today, can only make people shake their heads. No one cared about saving gasoline because gasoline was laughably cheap, only about $2 to $3 per barrel, almost unchanged for 20 years. At those prices, filling the tank of a large car was cheaper than taking the whole family out for dinner at an ordinary restaurant. The entire American economy, and the Western economy in general, was built on the unspoken assumption that oil would always remain cheap and abundant. Oil-powered factories, trucks, home heating during winter, to fertilizer for growing food, and plastics for everything from furniture to children's toys. It is not an exaggeration to say that the Western economy of the 1960s was like a giant machine, and oil was the only fuel it knew how to run on. The problem with unspoken assumptions is this: people do not realize they have them until those assumptions collapse. And on the other side of the world, one organization was quietly waiting for its moment. OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, had been established in 1960. But for more than a decade, it had almost no real voice. The reason was simple: giant Western oil companies, known as the Seven Sisters, controlled the entire chain of extraction, transportation, and oil pricing. Arab countries had the oil beneath their ground, but the people deciding the prices were executives sitting in luxurious offices in New York and London. By the early 1970s, the balance of power was beginning to shift. OPEC countries were gradually reclaiming control over their own resources. They were becoming more confident, more united, and more direct in asserting that the oil beneath their land belonged to them, not to corporations in New York. They only needed an excuse to prove it to the world. October of 1973, the excuse arrived. From a direction no one expected. The trigger, a war, a decision, and a president who was drowning. October 6th, 1973 was Yom Kippur, the holiest and most solemn day of the year for Jewish people. It is a day when Jewish people fast, pray, and almost the entire nation of Israel shuts down completely. No radio broadcasts, no television, no cars on the roads, an entire country simultaneously powering down for 25 hours. Egypt and Syria knew that very well, and they chose that exact day to attack. Egyptian forces surged across the Suez Canal from the west. Syrian forces poured down from the north through the Golan Heights. Israel was attacked from two directions at the same time. On the very day when most soldiers were at home praying with their families. Phones turned off. Radios silent. During the first days of the war, Israel suffered heavy losses in a way no one thought possible for one of the best-trained militaries in the region. Israel immediately appealed to Washington for help, and this is where the story becomes more interesting. The kind of interesting you would never want to experience if you were actually involved. President Nixon was now in the worst stage of his presidency, and that is a sentence rarely so accurate when describing a sitting American president. The Watergate scandal was escalating at an uncontrollable speed. Secret White House tapes had just been discovered. A special prosecutor was investigating. The press was swarming everywhere, and the threat of impeachment was hanging over his head every single day. Nixon was using every remaining ounce of political energy to try to save his presidency, but at the same time, he still had to make one of the most important geopolitical decisions of the decade. Nixon decided to resupply Israel. He launched Operation Nickel Grass, one of the largest military airlift operations in peacetime history. Hundreds of Cone 141 and C-5 Galaxy flights carried tanks, artillery shells, fighter aircraft, and anti-aircraft missiles into Israel for days without stopping. The scale was so massive that American pilots later recalled flying almost continuously without sleep. The balance on the battlefield began to shift. Israel launched a powerful counterattack and regained the initiative. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Arab nations were watching all of this with growing anger and thinking of a way to strike back without firing a single bullet. On October 17th, just 11 days after the war began, the Arab members of OPEC held an emergency meeting in Kuwait and made two historic decisions at the same time. First, they raised oil prices by 70%. Immediately, no negotiations, no warning. Effective that very day. Second, they imposed a total oil embargo against the United States, the Netherlands, and countries considered supportive of Israel, while also cutting oil production each month until there was progress toward an Israeli withdrawal. This was the first time in history that oil was openly used as a geopolitical weapon. Not bombs, not armies, just a valve being tightened shut. And it proved more effective than many other weapons. Within a few weeks, oil prices jumped from $3 to nearly $12 per barrel, an increase of 400%, not over a year, not over a quarter, but within weeks. Imagine filling your gas tank this morning at a normal price, then returning the next week to find the price 4 times higher? No warning, no transition plan, just higher. That is exactly what Americans and the entire Western world faced in the autumn of 1973. The world reacts, and no one reacts well. The United States, the world's #1 superpower, standing in line for gasoline. In November of 1973, A scene never before witnessed in peacetime appeared across major American cities, lines stretching for miles outside gas stations. People woke up at 4 or 5 in the morning, drove out in the darkness, and sat waiting. 2 hours, 3 hours. Some waited all morning just to fill one tank of gasoline. Many stations hung up out of gas signs before sunrise, and people who had already waited for 2 hours could only stare at the sign and drive home. Fights broke out directly in the waiting lines. People argued over cutting in line, buying too much gasoline, and countless small reasons that under normal circumstances no one would have cared about. Police had to be dispatched to restore order at gas stations, an image that no one in the history of peacetime America could previously have imagined. The American government panicked so badly that it introduced a rule that sounded strangely familiar. If you lived in a communist country, cars with even-numbered license plates could buy gasoline only on even-numbered days, while odd-numbered plates could buy gasoline only on odd-numbered days. Americans, who proudly saw themselves as citizens of the freest country in the world, a country where the government was not supposed to interfere in personal life, now had to look at their license plates to know whether they were allowed to buy gasoline that day. Nixon appeared on national television with a face tight with tension, urging citizens to turn off Christmas decorations, lower heating temperatures in their homes, and travel less. He even asked hotels and stores not to put up Christmas lights that year. Christmas of 1973 in America was darker than usual. In the most literal sense possible, the Netherlands, a bicycle paradise created by accident, the Netherlands was punished more heavily by OPEC than most other countries because it had allowed the United States to use air bases on Dutch territory to resupply Israel. The result was that OPEC completely cut off oil supplies to the Netherlands, not reduced, but completely cut off. The Dutch government held emergency meetings and made a decision that still sounds unreal even today, banning all citizens from driving on Sundays. No exceptions, no excuses accepted. Sundays would now become car-free days. And so, during the winter Sundays of 1973, one of the most modern and busiest highway systems in Europe suddenly became eerily empty. Dutch people pulled bicycles out of garages, storage rooms, and anywhere else they could find them. Then they rode in lanes built for cars on completely empty 6-lane highways in the freezing winter afternoon, wearing thick coats, cycling through roads that just a week earlier had been packed with rush hour traffic. International media rushed to the Netherlands to photograph those scenes, and the images became some of the most iconic symbols of the crisis. 6-lane highways stretching empty to the horizon, interrupted only by a few figures silently riding bicycles down the middle of the road. What no one expected was this Dutch people looked at those car-free streets and thought, wait, this actually does not look so bad. From that point on, movements demanding bicycle infrastructure exploded across the country. The government began seriously investing in cycling infrastructure, and the Netherlands gradually became the bicycle paradise, admired by the world to this day. In short, the oil crisis accidentally created one of the best and most sustainable urban transportation cultures in the world. No one planned this. No one sat in a meeting room and said, let's use this crisis to develop bicycle culture. It simply happened as an unexpected consequence of a situation nobody wanted. Japan, the panic buying incident that entered history. Japan had no oil, almost not a single drop. The country had to import more than 99% of the oil it consumed, and most of it came from the Middle East. When the embargo was announced, the Japanese panicked, and that reaction was completely understandable. The problem was the way they expressed that panic. Rumors began spreading. No one knew where they came from. No one knew who started them. That if paper factories ran out of oil to operate their machines, toilet paper would disappear from the market. No one stopped to verify whether the rumor made logical sense. No one asked whether the paper industry truly depended on oil to that extent. People simply heard it and went shopping. Then they saw other people buying and bought even more. Then supermarkets actually started running out of stock, not because there was a shortage of toilet paper, but because people had already bought everything. And when the shelves became empty, those who had not yet bought any panicked even more and rushed out to buy larger amounts. The cycle reinforced itself within days. Toilet paper shelves in supermarkets across Japan were completely empty. People lined up early in the morning, waiting for stores to restock. Some filled entire shopping carts with toilet paper and hauled them back home for storage. Japan's Prime Minister personally appeared on national television asking citizens to remain calm, assuring them there was no toilet paper shortage, and urging everyone to stop panic buying. People kept buying anyway. This became one of the most famous and heavily studied cases of panic buying in modern economic history. And the lesson from it is painfully simple during a crisis. Human beings do not behave logically. They behave according to what the people around them are doing, even when none of those people actually know what they are doing. In 2020, when COVID-19 swept across the world, humanity witnessed the exact same thing happen again with toilet paper. Once again, toilet paper in the United States, Britain, Australia, and dozens of other countries. Nearly 50 years later, with all the information and historical lessons available, humanity still behaved exactly like the Japanese in 1973. Some things human beings never truly learn. The consequences, things that never returned to the way they were before. Detroit and the death that was foretold before 1973. The American automobile industry stood at the peak of national pride. Detroit was producing cars whose names sounded like superheroes. Cadillac DeVille, Ford LTD, Chevrolet Impala, massive vehicles with roaring V8 engines, as long as ships, as heavy as tanks, and consuming gasoline with a generosity that could only exist in a world where fuel was almost free. No one cared about fuel efficiency because gasoline was cheap. That was simply the reality of life. Then the crisis arrived, and that reality collapsed within months. American consumers looked at the enormous Cadillac sitting in the garage, looked at the fuel prices glowing on the signs at gas stations, then looked over at the tiny Toyota Corolla parked nearby a car they previously would not even have considered because it looked too ordinary, too small, too un-American. That Corolla could travel nearly twice as far on the same amount of gasoline. No advertising needed. No discounts needed. No one needed to convince anyone. People switched automatically because the math was too obvious to ignore. Toyota, Honda, and Nissan suddenly became names discussed in every American household. The market share of imported cars in the United States rose from 15% to nearly 30% Within just 1 decade, Detroit tried to adapt by building smaller, more fuel-efficient cars. But building small cars was not in its DNA, and consumers recognized that immediately. Detroit's compact cars looked like large cars that had been unwillingly shrunk down. Not vehicles designed from the beginning around efficiency the way Japanese cars were. The shock of 1973 became the beginning of a decline that would last for decades, a decline that never fully reversed and eventually ended with the historic bankruptcy of General Motors in 2009, the fourth largest bankruptcy in American history. It all began on the day gasoline prices quadrupled. Stagflation, the thing textbooks did not teach. This is the part economists talk about, with expressions that are both horrified and excited, because for the first time in modern economic history, the world faced something. No one had a formula to solve. They called it stagflation, a combination of stagnation and inflation. It sounds simple, but the problem was that, in theory, these two things were not supposed to happen at the same time. Inflation usually came with an overheated economy. People had more money, bought more goods, and pushed prices upward. Stagnation usually came with deflation, fewer people buying things, causing prices to fall. The two were supposed to cancel each other out, at least in theory. But the sudden rise in oil prices shattered that entire logic. It pushed production costs higher for everything, because everything required energy to produce, causing prices across the economy to surge. At the same time, rising costs forced businesses to cut production, lay off workers, and reduce investment. The result was inflation, unemployment, and negative economic growth all happening at once. 3 disasters occurring simultaneously. Economists looked at the data and genuinely did not know what to do. If interest rates were raised to control inflation, the economy stagnated even more. If interest rates were lowered to stimulate growth, inflation exploded even further. Whatever policymakers did turned out wrong, because monetary policy tools had been designed for a world where these two conditions did not happen together. The 1970s became a decade in which Western governments tried almost everything, and almost none of it worked. Inflation in the United States reached as high as 12% per year at certain points, meaning the money in your pocket lost 12% of its value every year. Not because you had done anything wrong, but simply because the economy was operating like a car without brakes, energy security, and the mysterious salt caverns before 1973. The phrase energy security barely existed in the political vocabulary after 1973. It became one of the highest priorities for governments around the world. The United States did the first thing almost anyone does after suffering an unexpected blow, deciding never to let it happen again. In 1975, the United States Congress passed legislation establishing the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. They turned to massive salt mines deep underground in Louisiana and Texas, natural hollow chambers as large as skyscrapers, and began pumping oil into them, millions of barrels, then tens of millions, then hundreds of millions of barrels of oil were buried underground. Simply in case history repeated itself, the rest of the world followed. Japan, Germany, France, South Korea, all of them built their own strategic reserves. This became the most direct and visible legacy of 1973, hundreds of millions of barrels of oil hidden beneath the earth across the globe. like a silent reminder that prosperity may be more fragile than we think. Renewable energy, from science fiction to reality. And here is the least discussed consequence, but perhaps the most important in the long run. Before 1973, if you told a politician or an energy company executive that solar power would become the future, they would politely nod and continue drinking their coffee. Solar panels at the time were so expensive that only NASA used them to power satellites in space, where there were no other options. At several $100s per watt, solar energy was a technology of science fiction, not economic reality. After 1973, suddenly, every government wanted to pour money into researching alternative energy, not because they suddenly cared about the environment or climate change, but because they had just learned an incredibly expensive lesson, placing the entire economy of a nation on a single energy source from a single geographic region, controlled by a single group of countries, was a gamble that would eventually be lost. Engineers and scientists began receiving serious funding to study solar, wind, and nuclear energy. In 1977, President Carter installed solar panels on the roof of the White House as a political statement that America was serious about this path. Reagan came to power in 1981 and removed them also as a political statement, but in the opposite direction. But the wheel had already started turning, and it could not be stopped. Research funding had already been invested. Entire generations of engineers devoted their careers to making the technology cheaper and more efficient. And today, solar power is the cheapest source of electricity in human history. Cheaper than coal. Cheaper than natural gas. Cheaper than anything that existed before it. A significant part of that story began on the day a group of men sat in a meeting in Kuwait and decided to close the oil valve, the lesson, and why we keep having to learn it again. The years immediately after 1973 looked very promising. Cars became smaller and more fuel efficient. Homes were insulated more effectively. Fuel efficiency standards were written into law for the first time. Governments poured money into renewable energy research. People genuinely seemed to be changing the way they thought about energy. Then, the 1980s arrived, and oil became cheap again, and almost immediately, all of that seriousness evaporated. Cars gradually became larger again. This time, not giant sedans, but SUVs, then pickup trucks, then enormous trucks people used to commute to office jobs in cities, never carrying heavy cargo, never leaving paved roads, yet consuming fuel with a generosity that recalled the 1960s. The strategic petroleum reserves were still there. That was the lesson people remembered. But the deeper lesson, the lesson about not becoming too dependent on a single energy source, I was remembered for about a decade before people slowly forgot it as life became comfortable again. In 1979, just 5 years later, the second oil crisis erupted because of the Iranian Revolution. The world was shocked again. Americans stood in gasoline lines again. In 1990, the Gulf War pushed oil prices upward again. In 2008, oil prices reached $147 per barrel, the highest level in history at that time. And the world was stunned again. In 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and Europe suddenly realized it had allowed itself to become dependent on Russian natural gas to an almost unbelievable degree, doing the very thing that should have been avoided decades earlier. The same play different actors, different moments, but the same script, and every time, the world watches with a shocked expression, as if it has never seen it before. Human beings have one remarkably consistent trait. We are extremely good at learning lessons and extremely good at forgetting them once circumstances no longer force us to remember. Conclusion: The invisible thread. In 1973, a group of men sat in a meeting in Kuwait and decided to close the oil valve. They did not intend to transform the global automobile industry. They did not intend to create Dutch bicycle culture. They did not intend to accelerate solar energy research. They did not intend to teach the world an economic lesson that universities still study to this day. They were simply angry, and they acted on that anger, but history does not care about intentions. History only cares about consequences. Today, the world is shifting toward electric vehicles and lithium batteries. It sounds like the lesson has finally been learned. But lithium batteries require cobalt and lithium minerals concentrated in Congo, Chile, and supply chains largely controlled by China. We are moving from dependence on Middle Eastern oil to dependence on battery minerals from a handful of other countries. A new play with new actors. But if you read the script carefully, the structure looks very familiar. The next time you plug in an electric car, see solar panels on your neighbor's roof, or read news about conflict in the Middle East and watch gasoline prices rise, remember that all of those things are connected by an invisible thread stretching back to 1973. Back to the day the world ran out of fuel, and nobody was prepared for it. The question left behind is this: if China one day cuts off exports of battery minerals, the way OPEC cut oil in 1973, how would the world react? Have we prepared any better this time? Or would people once again rush to empty supermarket shelves of something else?